Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's combined cell group meeting. It is the month of November, and I had originally wanted to bring in a friend to talk about a special topic. But then, because this friend is engaged and she has signed a contract with her company, in that whatever she produces in the course of work and out of the course of work belongs to the company. Hence, she's unable to be with us today to talk about that topic that I want to talk about. I'm not going to disclose what topic is it. But then this session, right, I thought that I would want to give you a teaser on what we are going to cover next year as YA combined cell group meeting, and we will take a look at whether if this topic that I'm going to talk about interests all of you. If nobody has any objections to it, and people find that it is useful, then probably next year we will focus a little bit on this more rather than come out with a theme like this year, rest, right? So what I'm going to cover next year is on the area of Christian apologetics. Christian apologetics is an area in Christianity where you start to defend the Bible, defend your faith. But because it is a very wide topic, you can talk about anything under the sun as long as it is a defense of your faith. So my focus for 2022 would be specifically in the area of, here comes the big words, textual criticism, source criticism, historical criticism, and the canon. Do you know what is a canon? The canon is not something that fires a projectile out of a barrel. Instead, the canon is how the whole Bible is being formed, who sets the authority for the formation of the Bible. So this is what I'm going to talk about in 2022. By November 2021 today, I am going to give you a teaser, and also it is also a teaching session. So take it that in 2022, all the combined cell group meeting will be me teaching you something so that you are better rooted in your faith. Now, in the beginning of the previous decade, maybe in about 2015, Dan Brown, okay, if you have read his book, Dan Brown wrote a book that talks about the early church contorting the historical understanding and what actually happened in history regarding Jesus. He mentioned that this is the picture of the Last Supper, right? In the picture of the Last Supper, which is drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, he claimed that Leonardo da Vinci had some secret knowledge with respect to the identity of Jesus. And in his book, the Da Vinci Code, he claimed that the early church knew that Jesus wasn't the Jesus that we see in the Bible today. He claimed that Jesus was actually married. Dan Brown claimed that Jesus was actually married, and he made use of Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper to illustrate his point. If you take a look at this picture, you will see that it is the normal picture of a Last Supper, right? It may not be the original one, but this surely looks like the normal picture of the Last Supper. In the background, you have the Mount of Olives, dawning or sunsetting background. And Dan Brown says that the person sitting beside Jesus is actually Jesus' wife. Now, if we draw our attention to the person sitting beside Jesus, suddenly you realize that this guy looks feminine. It looks almost like a female. you compare the observation of this specific disciple with respect to the rest of the disciples sitting around Jesus. Suddenly, you realize that Dan Brown may make a little bit of sense in saying that the person sitting just beside Jesus is female and not male. Now, the next thing you want to do when you see this picture is to count the number of disciples in this picture. Now, if we count, you will see that it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12. Now, to make things a little bit more convincing, if I am to critique Christianity, I can say that actually it is 11 disciples plus Jesus' wife. Judas will be off to betray Jesus. But anyway, that is what Dan Brown claims. He claims that Jesus has a wife and the person sitting beside Jesus is his wife. But Da Vinci, after knowing about this, he deliberately hide the identity of this disciple, also known as his wife, in his painting, so that people from future generations will be able to discover this shocking truth. Another claim by Da Vinci is that because the disciple sitting beside Jesus, if you notice now, wears a color combination that is exactly opposite Jesus. So according to Dan Brown, this is his way of saying Da Vinci hiding the truth in his painting. Another point that I want to bring out from this Da Vinci Code is that there seems to be a 90-degree angle between Jesus and this supposedly woman. According to Dan Brown, this V is the sign of fertility. This V, according to Dan Brown, is the sign or the symbol for the female reproductive organ. Okay, so this V is the sign of a female reproductive organ. And because of this book that is written by Dan Brown, many churchgoers were very disturbed. They started to ask their pastors, is what Dan Brown claimed true? Or did Da Vinci know of a separate truth as compared to what the church believes? If you read Dan Brown's book, he will substantiate his claims with many seemingly correct historical facts. He claimed that there are a lot of councils back in the first few centuries to come and talk about what goes into the Bible and what does not go into the Bible. It seems very convincing because I have read the book myself back in 2015-ish, and it is really very well written. But from there, you will see that Christianity was threatened. So how should Christians react to all these claims? Dan Brown is only one of the many claims to try to discredit Christianity. So how should Christians react to such claims? Number one, you can ask your pastor, okay? But generally, we are not equipped to answer such questions. Why? Because we may not have a good understanding of history and the happenings that bring about the Bible that we hold in our hands. My proposal is this, the wording in pink. We can believe in the Bible, but this does not necessitate us leaving our brains behind. Which means to say we can believe in the Bible, yet be objective. We can believe in the Bible, yet be logical. Okay? The next advice that we can or the next stance that we can adopt is that we can be critical, but not overly skeptical. We can be critical, but not overly skeptical. If you are skeptical about everything, then your world will start crumbling because you start to ask everything that happens around you. For example, the person that lives with you lives with your father, and your father calls her your mother. How do you prove that the lady that has been living in my household is my mother? Okay, so we can be critical, but we try not to be skeptical, and we want to seek the truth. Now, some of the questions that are posed by these people who try to instill doubts in the Christian faith are questions such as this. If the first Gospels were written decades after the life of Jesus, how do we know that the writers got the story right? Now, I'm going to address all these questions one by one, depending on how much time we have, but definitely we will try our best to explain all these things. So in the case that your friends start to approach you and ask you about all these things, at least you will have the confidence to believe that the Bible that we hold in our hands is true. Next question, if the writers got the story right, how do we know the Gospels and other New Testament documents were copied faithfully? Is what we have now what they wrote then? And the third question is, if the writers got the story right and the documents were copied faithfully, how do we know the right documents were included in the Bible? How did the church decide which ones to include? And was there a conspiracy to hide competing books? I'm sure you are aware of many other books that are not in the Christian Bible. If you just compare the Christian Bible and the Catholic Bible, you will see that, oh, the Catholic Bible has a few more books in the Old Testaments. So naturally, this question will arise. How or who dictate which books to be included in the Bible? And what about the books that are out of the Bible, such as the Gospel of St. Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Adam, and so on and so forth? How do we view all these books? If the writers got the story right, the documents were copied faithfully, and the right documents were included in the Bible, what does this say about the earliest belief in Jesus? Did Jesus's followers view him more than a man from the onset of Christianity? Or was Jesus' divinity the invention of a 4th century church council? Okay, so we are going to address this as well. Did the 4th century church council demonize Jesus? Did the earliest people believe that Jesus is divine? If the writers got the story right, the documents were copied faithfully, the right documents were included in the Bible, and the Bible reveals belief in the divinity of Jesus, how do we know that the whole thing wasn't plagiarized from other religions? How are you going to address to your friends if they ask such questions? These questions are tough questions, and it would be good for me to address all this to give you more confidence. Now, our focus in 2022 would be talking about the integrity of the New Testament text, because it bears witness to the historic belief in the divinity of Jesus. So we were going to talk about the integrity of the New Testament text, because we believe that Jesus is portrayed as divine in the Bible. Well, we will also let history and the Bible build their own case for Christ. I'm not going to bring in many theological concepts and things to fight for the divinity of Christ. but we will investigate from history and from the biblical text. We let the Bible prove itself. Now, if you recall, Jesus has a disciple by the name of Thomas, and Thomas is commonly known as Thomas the Doubter because he told the rest of the disciples, unless I see the nail marks on his hands and put my finger where the nails were, and to put my hand into his side, I will not believe. This was what Thomas talked about. Now, this was what Thomas relayed as the rest of the disciples testified that Jesus was alive. When Jesus appeared to Thomas, he said, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Immediately, when Thomas met Jesus and Jesus issued this invitation, did Thomas put his fingers where the nails were? If you read your Bible, Thomas did not. Thomas did not put the finger where the nails were. Immediately, he exclaimed, my Lord and my God. When Thomas saw Jesus and Jesus issued the invitation, Thomas didn't do what he wanted to do originally, and he exclaimed, my Lord and my God. From this painting, you will see that the scroll that is held on Thomas' hand reflected my Lord and my God. Tradition says that Thomas, after meeting Jesus, after the incidents recorded in the book of Acts, Thomas went to preach to the people in India. In fact, there is a tradition in India that Thomas ministered to the place called Kerala in India. And if you see the churches in India right now, there is actually a church that is named after Thomas the Apostle. Okay, it is worth investigating whether Thomas went to India and started the church there, but it is beyond the scope of what we are going to cover today. In Singapore, we have a St. Thomas Orthodox Church at the end of Yio Chu Kang. At the end of Yio Chu Kang, very, very near Zixin's house. If you ask Zixin will know about this church, St. Thomas Orthodox Church. Okay, and naturally, because Thomas went to India, St. Thomas Orthodox Church is a church that caters to the Indian community. Now, Jesus did not scold Thomas for his doubt. Instead, he called him to examine the evidence. So what we are going to do in this next year is to examine the evidence and see for ourselves whether the claims by people casting doubts on our religion can be substantiated and how the Bible can fight for himself. Now, in this session, time is running out, okay? But in this session, we are going to talk about something called the Synoptic Gospel. Synoptic Gospel. What is it? What is the Synoptic Gospel? We may not have heard about it. How come we never hear about it? Okay? And how will this new knowledge change the way we look at the Bible? How will this new knowledge change the way we look at the Bible? If you take 门徒, you will definitely come across this term, Synoptic Gospel. In Chinese, it's known as 符类圣经. 符类圣经. What is the meaning of Synoptic Gospel? Synoptic comes from two words, syn and optics. It means similar points of view. And it refers to the first three Gospels in the New Testament. It is the book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So when we say synoptic gospel, they surely must have some areas of similarity. And the question that we are going to ask ourselves today, in fact now, is that, is there a literary relationship among the synoptic gospel? In short, we are asking if the writers of the first 3 books of the gospel plagiarize each other. Now, plagiarism is something that is invented in the modern days. In the olden days, there isn't a penalty for plagiarism. Now, before we even go into this, I extracted most of my data from the book called Reinventing Jesus. This book is available in Amazon. If you are interested and you are dedicated, you can in fact buy this book and read for yourself. But of course, the bulk of the outline and materials come from this book. I will definitely add in my own external evidences and source material for all of us to learn. Okay, so synoptic gospel. Now, during this whole teaching sessions, I try my best not to make use of language that you do not know. So I'm going to try my best to refrain from using Greek, try my best to refrain from reading from the Hebrew text, because if I read, only I understand, you all don't understand. So instead of that, I'm going to make use of the NIV Bible, NIV English Bible, to substantiate and allow the Bible to prove for himself. Now, in this slide, you will see Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptic gospel. And just by a casual glance, you will see that there are many similarities between these 3 accounts. Matthew chapter 4, verse 12 to 17. Now, when he heard that John was delivered up, he withdrew into Galilee. Okay. In Mark chapter 1, verses 14 to 15, it says, now after John was delivered up, Jesus came into Galilee. Luke chapter 4, verse 14 to 15, and Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee. What do you observe from this? You see that Matthew and Mark contain now John was delivered up into Galilee. Okay, they are not in one sentence, but this is what you observe in Matthew and Mark. Now, John was delivered up into Galilee. These are the few words that resonates in Matthew and Mark. What about Luke? What about Luke? They talk about into Galilee. Into Galilee. So, could there be a literary dependence on these 3 authors? In other words, did these 3 authors copy each other, since there are so many similarities observed just from these 2 verses? We'll keep this at the back of our heads as we investigate the next slide. Okay, the same thing. The first column, Matthew, second column, Mark, and the third column, Luke. You see that in this comparison, a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and in his own house. This is the account in Matthew. And the account in Mark, a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and among his own kin and in his own house. The account in Luke, verily I say unto you, no prophet is acceptable in his own country. It looks as if that you they copy each other, right? A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and in his own house. So how are we as Christians going to understand all these things? Did they really plagiarize from each other? The parables in the gospel, okay, this is just a short excerpt from the parables in the gospel. You see that whatever that is written in Mark, they are reflected in Matthew and Luke. However, there are certain parables that are written in Matthew that is not reflected in Mark, but repeated in Luke. All the way in this slide, you will see that until the talents, right? These are the ones that are reflected in Matthew and also reflected in Luke. But the first part of this chart or this table tells us that there are similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So what actually is going on when Pastor Sean introduced the concept of the Synoptic Gospel? What is he trying to tell us? How would scholars understand this thing? So some people believe that in writing these three books, Jesus is the one that impart all the data. And all this data is collated into something known as the primitive gospel, And as time passed by, this primitive gospel being the source of all the facts, the source of all the happenings and teachings and sayings of Jesus, became three different books known as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In short, the primitive gospel became the source for Matthew, Mark, and Luke to plagiarize. Now, we must highlight once again that plagiarism is a modern term. Plagiarism is a modern term. So modern that even during the days of me studying in Ngee Poly, right? Plagiarism wasn't actively enforced at all. I, in fact, did my third year project plagiarizing about 90% out of a book in the library. So I got a distinction for that. Okay, so back then, even in the 1990s, plagiarism wasn't a big thing in academia. So having said that, it is worth repeating that plagiarism is a modern concept. Okay, so did Matthew, Mark, and Luke plagiarize from the primitive gospel? What do the early church believe? Now, in the 5th century, there is a bishop by the name of Augustine. St. Augustine of Hippo, he is the bishop. He believed that these three books has a priority in Matthew. Okay, scholars call this the Markian priority. Okay, so he believed that Matthew recorded everything. And Mark wrote the second gospel, and then Luke drew materials from Mark and Matthew. Okay, this is Augustine's theory in the 5th century. It is not until the late 20th century, with the invention of the printing press and the invention of computers, where scholars are able to investigate and analyze text in closer detail. So in 1745, there is this guy that is born in 1745 by the name of Johann Jakob Griesbach. He proposed this Griesbach hypothesis. It is also commonly known as the two gospel hypothesis. He says that Matthew, it is the same as what Augustine, very, very similar to what Augustine proved. Augustine say Matthew and then Mark, then Luke draw from Matthew and Mark. But now, Griesbach say that Matthew is the original document. Then comes Luke. And then when Mark tries to come out with his material, Mark drew from Luke and Matthew. Now, the difference between St. Augustine and Griesbach is that they swapped the position of Mark and Luke. They swapped the position of Mark and Luke. But then, Griesbach also proposed a Matthean priority in the text, which means Matthew has the original text of the gospel. Then, in 1955, this Farah Golder, these two people, Farah and Golder, they come up with this hypothesis called the Farah's theory. Farah's theory, instead of Matthean priority, these scholars propose that it is Mark that has priority, Markian priority. And the source document being from Mark came Matthew, and Luke copied from Matthew and Mark. As everything, you see that the development of all these theories gets more and more complicated as the year go by. This is 1955. 1955, you have the printing press already, right? So everything is printed out. You can compare, you can highlight, you can compare word for word. And then this Farah and Golder came out with this hypothesis that it is Mark that is the original document that came Matthew, and eventually Luke copied both sources. Then there is this B.H. Streeter that is before Farah. Before Farah, this is 1924. He came up with this two-source hypothesis. It says that the original document was from Mark. Then Mark supplied the material for Matthew and Luke. On top of this, there is an unknown source called the Q. Q in German refers to the source. So there is a hidden source that we cannot find. Okay, and Streeter said that Mark was the original. Mark was the original manuscript. Matthew, in crafting out his gospel, drew from Mark and Q. And Luke, when crafting out the gospel, drew from Mark and Q as well. Mark and Q as well. Can follow? So Mark became the supplier of Matthew and Luke. So this is called the two-source hypothesis. Note that the year was 1924 by the scholar called B.H. Streeter. Now, 1 year later, B.H. Streeter in 1925, 1 year later, he came up with this four-source hypothesis. It says that, you see, Matthew comes with another M, Luke came with another L. These are documents called the Proto-Matthew and the Proto-Luke documents. So in this four-source hypothesis, it is postulated that Markian priority, the original source is from Mark. And when Matthew is writing out the gospel, Matthew drew from Mark and a proto-Matthew source and Q. Whereas for Luke, when crafting out the gospel, he drew from Mark and Q and a proto-Luke source. Proto means first, first Luke source. Proto-Luke and proto-Matthew. They draw from all these sources to compile into a gospel called Matthew and Luke. It gets more and more complicated. Okay. Of course, there are more hypotheses, but these are the main scholarly understood or scholarly accepted hypothesis regarding the Synoptic Gospel. So, summary, what we have learned today is that concerning literary dependence, the theory of marked priority is most accepted. Marked priority is most accepted, which means to say Mark is the original source, and Mark supplied Matthew and Mark supplied Luke. It appears that Mark is the oldest, and both Matthew and Luke often depended on Mark's documentation to write their gospel. In the next session, we are going to talk about questions such as, how do we know the gospel writers got it right? Why was the writing of the gospels delayed for decades? What happened in the meantime? Isn't it likely that the gospel writers simply forgot about most of the details Jesus said and did by the time they put pen to papyrus? Since all the gospel writers were obviously people of faith, Christians, how do we know their faith didn't get into the way of accurate historical reporting? Since they were writing to specific communities, how do we know they didn't radically rework the material to meet the needs of their audiences? Okay, so this is what we are going to talk about in 2022. In December this year, we are going to depart away from this, and I have invited a guest speaker to speak in our combined self-group meeting. So this brings us to the end of today's sharing self-group meeting and combined self-group meeting. Like always, I'm going to type out our questions for discussion in our Zoom chat, and maybe later on we will be able to break up into our individual cell groups and we can discuss what we have learned today. God bless you. Bye bye.